This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
Good afternoon. I'm thrilled to be back, and the Fromm has been on my mind a lot in the last few weeks. I've just returned from 3 weeks in Greece and a brief sojourn back at the British Museum, preparing for this class and thinking about how good it is to be able to live long enough that we can recognize not only our grandchildren, but also be able to be in an era when there's that biblical phrase you may recall about a blessed life living 60 years and 10. And I think we're already exceeding that, aren't we? Many of us. So my brothers, I have, as you may know, I'm one of 5 boys. My brothers are convinced that I'm taking a lot of preservatives because I still have hair on my head, and so far it's the original color. But it's interesting, isn't it, when you become over 65. And for the first time, my medical insurance bill dropped below $1,000 a month for years. So there's something to be said for, getting vintage, right? So today, we're going to be looking at some vintage material. And I'm thrilled because in 25 years teaching at Stanford, I've never been allowed to teach this to undergrads. It was felt that they were too much tabula rasa, too impressionable, that they couldn't distinguish between presuppositions and things like that. I've been able to teach it a few times, Archaeology and the Bible, to adults. And there was a previous archaeology chair at Stanford who wrote things about Marxist reflexology and felt that the material in the book called the Bible is a bunch of hogwash. So, understandably, you can draw your own conclusions why I was not allowed to teach archaeology of the Bible to undergrads. But here we get an opportunity to look at material that is constantly argued, constantly debated, very contentious. If you have ever read that journal, Biblical Archaeology Review, you may know that Herschel Shanks loves to pit people against each other, spitting, fighting, arguing, even mudslinging, or throwing potsherds. So it is a difficult area. And just, again, to do a little bit of background, my first BA was in linguistics and biblical studies, 2 majors. My first master's degree was in biblical studies. My PhD is in archaeology, particularly archaeological science, but my first professional position was in the Near Eastern Studies Department at University of California at Berkeley as a postdoc research fellow, where I'm also an alum, by the way. So I feel that I've come full circle getting to be able to teach this. And a few little publications along the way, the Orientalia Analecta Lovenensia series, Phoenicia and the Bible, on texts, also several Beitrage zur Erforschung des Alten Testament und des Antiken Judentums, and other things. I think I came out in Who's Who in Biblical Studies and Archaeology a couple times. So I rarely get to be able to go off something that I feel is a strong point. So, and then a new book that came out in December, When Empires Clash, with some of the material that we'll cover a little bit in here. The Battle of Nineveh, the Battle of Masada, and so on. So I'm really excited. Let's dive in, shall we? Now today, I think there's a sort of an outline coming. It's not their fault. I only sent it to them about a half an hour ago. My computers are in bad shape. When I came back from Greece, somehow something infected my computers. So that outline will be coming in a few minutes. But today, we'll look primarily at paradise gardens, Dilmun and Eden. And yet, we have to start off with an introduction about this very, very debatable material. Anytime you talk about the Bible, you know you're going to rile 95% of the audience with comments that are often fighting words. Yes? Why? Well, because it's perceived primarily as a religious text. And that's, again, understandably why I think I wasn't allowed to teach to undergrads, even though there was a petition for that. But I think there's a term that we can suggest maybe explains some of the battlegrounds. When you talk about biblical archaeology, there's an immediate problem with that, because the word biblical suggests religion. Archaeology should suggest science. So when you use an adjective which is religious or philosophical to modify a noun that is supposedly scientific and historical, you have an immediate, shall we say, tension. You can understand that, yes? And that's why I prefer to use the phrase archaeology and the Bible, to not quite look at them as if it's an easy alloy, because it's not. Now, in the 1960s and 70s, something came about called the New Archaeology, which is possibly anthropological, certainly philosophically attempting to be neutral. Whether it is or not remains to be seen. But we have to recognize that the whole discipline of archaeology started because people were looking at the Bible and wanting to find, could this actually be a place in the world where the texts find support? And the word archaeology used to mean philology, old words, old ideas. It's only since the 19th century that archaeology became a physical material history discipline with excavations that started off a little iffy, if you know Schliemann's techniques, although Austin Henry Layard at Nineveh and other sites around the world, while people were trying to see if there might be material support for textual history, that is, the Bible, archaeology has come a long way. And yet, you can hardly look at the news without seeing something pop up that attempts to suggest one way or the other whether or not the biblical texts have support. Now, what this means, so in our introduction, there are people who are minimalists biblically, and there are people who are maximalists biblically. What does that mean? Biblical minimalists say that there's no support whatsoever historically for the Bible. It's just a religious text. And then the biblical maximalists say the opposite. No, there's plenty of support. I'd like to think I'm in the middle, but I'm probably not. You'll see. I think that if we look at the idea, archaeology in the Bible, the minimalists who reduce and the maximalists who maybe expand, perhaps too much. Some of the questions that have been brought up a lot, these are recurring questions. For example, and they're not going to be dealt with necessarily in order, Did Israel exist before the 9th century BCE? And you know I use BCE instead of BC, because BC is kind of a religious framework. So BCE and CE are the same dates as BC and AD. But instead of using Anno Domini, we use CE Common Era. They dovetail at the same point, what we could call sort of year zero or whatever. But did Israel exist before the Iron Age is the question. The second question, did the Hebrew language exist before the 10th century BCE? So these are two vital questions. And then, did Hebrew scriptures exist before the Babylonian captivity around between 604 to 586 BCE when Nebuchadnezzar came? These are, again, really vital questions. Many people believed that under the reign of Josiah, there was something called the Deuteronomic revision, where many of the so-called historical scriptures were either written or so redacted, as you could say, that they date from the late 7th century BCE. And that in Babylonian captivity, when the temple was destroyed, the Jews suddenly became focused really strongly on all they had left, which were the scriptures. And therefore, that Judaism as a religion, the Israelites as a people, or Judeans as a remnant people, became really obsessed with textuality. That's a question that deserves examination too. And then the last question, these are not the only four, but the last question I think we could at least address. The so-called united monarchy. Did David really exist? Did Solomon really exist? Were there kingdoms as described in the glowing terms of texts such as 1 Kings, where Solomon is said to be the wisest and richest man in the world, where his kingdom extends all the way to the upper Euphrates and down to Egypt, and where he received so much gold in a given year, 660 talents of gold from the near mythical Queen of Sheba, and so on and so on and so on. So how much can we look at these questions? We're just going to just very briefly sketch on this today, literally archaeologically scratch the surface, but you'll see also there have been major proponents and advocates and so on. Israel Finkelstein at Tel Aviv University and Neil Asher Silberman, a writer, they're probably good exponents for the minimalist view. And then Gabriel Barquet and Alan Millard are probably good exponents for the maximalist view. Now before them, there have been others, of course. You may have heard of W.F. Albright, William Foxwell Albright in Jerusalem and Johns Hopkins University, who was a very strong maximalist. There have been many, many others that we could cite for both camps. But gradually, in the 20th century, people moved away from actually you could say even before that, with the idea of literary criticism, higher criticism in the German universities in the late 18th and 19th centuries. There was this Graf Wellhausen hypothesis that really seriously attacked the authorship of the so-called Pentateuch Torah as being Mosaic, and there were a lot of evidences that showed, according to that hypothesis of higher criticism, that true literary examination shows there are a lot of holes in the conservative views about biblical scholarship. This continued in the 20th century and really snowballed, particularly after Israel became a nation again in 1947, 48, and 49, particularly 48, 49. The idea that archaeology became a very popular pastime. If you lived in Israel, almost everyone was an amateur archaeologist. And when I lived in Israel and in Jerusalem in the mid-'80s, archaeology was still just a burgeoning discipline, and you could go to courses at the American Institute, as I did, or at Hebrew University, and you could see and hear some of the debates. But gradually the minimalists became dominant in the 80s and 90s. Now it appears the pendulum may be swinging back, which would be intriguing if it could be true. As I told you, I like to think I'm in the middle, but I'm probably not. And I'll because I only think it's fair to tell you that Gabriel Barquet was a teacher at the American Institute where I was in the mid-'80s. And also, when I was at a conference, the International Organization for the Study of the Old Testament, at the Sorbonne, at the University of Paris, I was giving a paper there. And after I gave my paper, which I'll share later, in a week or two, a little bit of it, Alan Millard from the University of Liverpool came up and practically said it would be a huge injustice if I did not publish this paper on the flint knives of Judges 5 through 7. And he said that it was something that really needed to be brought to the public, because most of the arguers at this conference panel were talking about prehistoric relics and recidivism in the text. Anyway, I'll get back to that. But so even though, as I said, I want to try to look at both sides fairly, I will admit I'm smugly pleased that the pendulum's swinging back the other way. All right? So you know where I stand, kind of. And I'm open to whatever challenge. Now, here's the Bible Unearthed. A lot of people bought this book. Maybe you did. It looks like it's going to lay a wonderful case for you. Archaeology's new vision of ancient Israel and the origin of its sacred texts. These are, as I said, two staunch minimalists, at least have been for a long time. Maybe not quite so recently, but notice this is from the publisher's note. In this iconoclastic and provocative work, leading scholars Israel Finkelstein and Neil Ashwell Silverman draw on recent archaeological research to present a dramatically revised portrait of ancient Israel and its neighbors. They argue that crucial evidence, or better, or a telling lack of evidence, at digs in Israel, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon suggests that many of the most famous stories in the Bible, the wanderings of the patriarchs, the exodus from Egypt, Joshua's conquest of Canaan, and David and Solomon's vast empire, reflect the world of the later authors rather than actual historical facts. Now, you have to get into the book to see this. How many of you have seen the book or read the book? May I see? One or two. Okay. I know a lot of people who read it, and they came away very disgruntled because they wanted to go the other way. And to be fair, Israel Finkelstein really has had very exacting standards for what he calls evidence, and I think that's excellent. Here's a small excerpt from it. An archaeological analysis of the patriarchal conquest judges of the United Monarchy narrative shows that while there is no compelling archaeological evidence for any of them, there's clear archaeological evidence that places the stories themselves in a late 7th century BCE context. That's the so-called Deuteronomic revision. That's the position that's been held for a long time. But let's go back to these questions. Did Israel exist before the 9th century BCE? Well, certainly the word Israel existed before the 9th century BCE, because outside, what you always need is, you have biblical texts, but you need evidence outside the biblical texts. Do you all agree with that? You want to see evidence outside the text. It just so happens that the Merneptah stele, one of the very last of the Ramesside dynastic kings, if you go down to 21st, 22nd dynasty, what we have in the late 13th century dynasty is this Egyptian stele. And really about 1213 to 1205 BCE. So, the word Israel actually easily exists in it. And here's a small part of it, which says, Israel's laid waste, his seed is no more. And I can't point to it exactly, but it's down in the lower part of the text, You can see where the crack is down there. It's just below that cracked part. But literally, it's not seen, even though it's couched somewhat literarily, it's not seen as poetry. Well, that was actually excavated in 1896 by Sir William Mather Flinders Petrie. And yet, there was a big debate about what it meant. But at least the word Israel existed outside the biblical texts. And I think that's important. Now, Finkelstein and others, though, said that that's not proof physically for Israel existing. And they're right. But we're going to come back to some of these. But did the Hebrew language exist before the 10th century? Many people said, Finkelstein has said, and others, that the so-called Israelites were merely wandering migrants in the land of Canaan and did not have any kind of social structure. They were loosely amalgamated, and maybe the recipients or the Amarna letters discuss some of these kinds of people who are like brigands, but do they speak a different language than what we can call the language of Canaan? Now, just a little bit of a nudge here. You may have heard the word Amorite, Amorite. That's a Greek word. The Hebrew word, Amorites, Greek plural for the Amorite people, Amorites, the Hebrew word is Amurim. And yet what it really means, the Amuru in Mesopotamia were the Westerners. So they were the people who actually migrated out of the Mesopotamian Tigris, Euphrates, area and migrated north and west and down. They didn't go through the Nephud Desert. They went around and followed the Euphrates. And technically, that follows the ways that cities and habitations developed in the early Bronze Age, moving further and further to the northwest. And so this story about, and I'll talk about this next week, this story about Abraham's migration from has an overall historical basis, whether Abram exists or not. But the language of the Amorites is very close to Hebrew because if you look at Ugaritic or Canaanite language, there's a lot of overlap in syntax and vocabulary, morphology, phonetics, and so on. But does it exist on its own? Is it an independent language? In the last 6 or 7 years, excavations at a place called Khirbet Qeiyafa in the Judean hills, just above the Shephelah, where the Judean hills drop down into the coastal Mediterranean plain. This site of Khirbet Qeiyafa, which means the ruins of Qeiyafa, have shown some fascinating things. Maybe arguable, but here is the site in the Judean hills, and that's looking to the south, and the Elah River is right off, if you look at that ravine running across the middle of the picture, that's the Elah Valley, and it's also purportedly the place where one of the great battles between Israel and the Philistines occurred. Might be someone's, yeah. Oh, that's an Amber Alert? Okay, well, let's go on. If none of you has been abducted, let's go on. So there's the Elah River running through the picture, and this excavation, Professor Garfinkel of Hebrew University and Galal, two of the professors have been running this since 2007 and 2008, but suddenly 2009 onward, some fascinating things have come to light. It was felt that there were no Judean sites in the 11th, 10th century. But in fact, is that still the same ambient noise? Okay. Is it in somebody's... no. Okay. All right. So here, looking at this picture, this site, based on pottery and radiocarbon dates, shows that it is easily 11th century BCE, which is the time when David, by all chronologies, would have existed. Not only is it a Judean site with very strong radiocarbon dates and pottery dates that show at the end of the second millennium BCE, going into the first millennium BCE, that's the transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age. And in fact, this site, that's when Egypt is weak and when Mesopotamia is weak. Usually, there's this ebb and flow, this flux going on in the ancient Near East. Either Egypt is strong and dominates the coastal Levant, which would today be around Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and so on. Either Egypt was strong, and you see a lot of Egyptian artifacts, scarabs and hieroglyphic material and Egyptian motifs, or Mesopotamia is dominating, and that push comes over down the Euphrates, down into this same area. So there's this ebb and flow throughout history. One of my professors said that Israel and the Levant is the land between. Interestingly, in the 11th century BCE, there's a power vacuum. Neither Mesopotamia nor Egypt are dominant. And what happens, it allows a bit of respite for this land and the people therein to exercise autonomy. This can be proven, but I won't go into a lot of details today. So here is evidence to the contrary that there are Judean sites, there are Israelite sites in these hills. The pottery, the potsherds, even the inscriptions, and in fact, the radiocarbon dates all support this. Plus, there was a architectural fortification style called casemate walls, which this site has. A double wall. You can just see a little bit of it down the very, very forefront. All along this fortress, there was a double wall called casemate wall, which has been identified as an 11th, 10th century archaeological extant remain. Now, to add to it, here is something fascinating. Here is a potsherd with an inscription on it, and the inscription is also dated, both by the ink and everything else, 11th, 10th century. Here's a transcription of it on the right, and while the letters are very similar to what we would expect for Canaanite, Amorite at the time, Ugaritic, late Ugaritic, we actually have this. This is the inscriptional translation by Gershon Galil, and it says, "You shall not do it, but worship the Lord, judge the slave and the widow, judge the orphan and the stranger, plead for the infant, plead for the poor and the widow, rehabilitate the poor, the hands of the king, protect the poor and the slave, support the stranger." Now, what's interesting is there are several words in this text that do not exist in Canaanite, only existing in Hebrew. And one of the words for slave here, ebed, or eved, is only Hebrew. Doesn't exist in the Ugaritic, doesn't exist in Canaanite, doesn't exist in Amorite or any other texts. And then you also have the word almanah, almanah, in this case, widow, which is only a Hebrew word. There are others too, but while this evidence has been argued back and forth, it's strong evidence that there really was Hebrew language at the time. And if that's not enough, here also is a name on a potsherd, Ishbaal, which is also the name of one of Saul's sons, Saul the first king of Israel, the Benjaminite. So we have words we have words and names that appear in the contemporary texts of the biblical material and sites that seem to corroborate that there were indeed these settlements all throughout the hills, and this only being one that is currently being excavated. I could go into more detail, but certainly you could look up Khirbet Kayafa yourself. Now, interesting, one of the other questions, let's drop down one though to the bottom. Were David and Judahist literature merely propaganda, particularly 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings? Well, the name David appears in a stele from Tel Dan. Now, here it is, and if you see the little letters limned in white on the right, it reads in Hebrew, Beit David, house of David. And it's not a poetic term, it's a literal dynast. It's a dynastic term, saying that there really was a lineage of David. This is just one evidence for it, and that's looking at Paleo-Hebrew. And if you read at this time, in fact, if you read later Phoenician, it looks very much like similar orthography, similar letters. But the name House of David was not a poetic term. It was a literal phrase for a dynastic succession. Now, the question, did the Hebrew Scriptures exist before the Babylonian captivity of 600 BCE, the so-called Deuteronomic revision? You may have just read recently, this last week, about the Arad letters. Anybody read about that? Good, a fair number of you. I just put it here, and I'm not going to go online for it, but this is Live Science, which is a good, credible site, and it says, according to the masthead, the Bible is really old, handwriting analysis reveals. You may have seen this just hitchhiking all throughout the news. Just so, Dr. Dato, you can confirm that's what that says. Yes? Yes. Okay. So, the argument with these Arad letters, and I'm going to go back to that, so please don't lose it. Here is one of the texts. These are potsherds on Arad was a fort not too far from the Dead Sea, where the plateau goes up high and then drops down again. And I remember when I was at Arad, it's a pretty dry place. But these potsherds that came from it were written by different scribes, and this is one of them. This is the way you brush when you use ink on a text. And again, the ink shows that these are pre-600 BCE, and there's quite a few of them. And what the analysis shows is that there are at least 6 different people who are scribes. Now, they're not professional scribes, but they're common soldiers, a quartermaster, different people. And the new evidence suggests that literacy was far higher in Israel than anybody heretofore imagined. I'm just going to read a little bit of this to you. It says, the shards found at the frontier fort were written by at least 6 different people, suggesting that literacy was widespread in the ancient kingdom of Judah. We're dealing with really low-level soldiers in a remote place who can write. Some of them said, send that wine tomorrow. And make sure you seal your letter, and so on and so on and so on. Now, I'm not going to read all this, but it says that the writing shows that the kingdom of Judah had the intellectual resources to write and compile large chunks of the Hebrew Scriptures during this period. Religious scholars have long fiercely debated when the Bible was written, and so on and so on and so on. But scholars assumed that the text about the destruction of Jerusalem was written just before the temple was destroyed, but people weren't sure if that was historically accurate. Now, so in fact, some even said that the compilation of the Hebrew Scriptures was during the Persian Greco period, the Seleucid Hellenistic period. Now, these inscriptions reveal many people, if low-level soldiers in a fort could read and write, The question is, how many more could read or write that in a larger segment of the population? So they applied algorithms to this. They copied out all the letters, and they then separated them, and then they had a computer resort them based on writing styles. So the algorithm was able to take them apart literarily, put them back together based on that this person's writing looked like that person's writing, and so on. And they kept pairing these and found out that there are at least 6 different people writing these letters. So, guess who is one of the authors of this study? Israel Finkelstein. And here's what he says. This is really amazing, Finkelstein says, that in a remote place like this, there was more than one person, several people who could write. There are many other people who are getting onto this. George Washington University scholar Christopher Ralston says, I've argued in print for a long time that the literacy of elites is already present by before 800 BCE. So there are people who say, yes, I've been waiting for this kind of evidence. So we'll see if there's any blowback against this. But the suggestion then that literacy is already high in the 7th century kind of undermines the idea that the scriptures were only written after the Deuteronomic revision. And then I won't go into all the details, but this question, were David and the Judahist literature merely propaganda? Is 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, is it propaganda, make-believe, is it fiction? Well, Israel Finkelstein, who, with a good friend of mine, Eric Klein, have been excavating at Megiddo, Tel Megiddo, for years. Recently, new radiocarbon dates come out showing that there is an 11th, 10th century settlement at Megiddo, which was argued against by Finkelstein for a long time. But the new radiocarbon date suggests that no, Megiddo was indeed a Solomonic fortress, just as described in 2 Kings. So, these are just some of the things we're going to get into in the next 8 weeks. I'm only giving you the sketchiest of, literally sketchiest, of data, but we'll come back to this and look more at these. But since many of you have been following the news, I knew someone was going to ask me today if I'd seen the new evidence for the Arad letters. So don't take my word for it. Do your own sleuthing on these. But now let's go to Eden and Dilmun, shall we? So here you can see, unless there are questions, we can stop just for a moment and if there are some questions. Anything about what has been presented so far? Yes? Okay. A fort like Arad, which had maybe 100 people. It's in a remote part, very far from Jerusalem. It's about the furthest outpost you could get in Judah, practically overlooking the Dead Sea. A fort having this few number of people, when you have scribes, you're suggesting usually a much larger populated area with the presence of elites, and there's absolutely no evidence for anything here but low-level soldiers. So, to answer the question, if Israel Finkelstein is satisfied these are low-level soldiers, so am I. But good question. Anybody else before we go on? What determines a scribe, you see? If it's an official scribe, that's a copyist employed by either the religious or federal hierarchy of the land. In this case, it doesn't appear to be that they're professional scribes at all. And that's why this is so astonishing. Terrence.
How much in military or forts and things like that would normally be used on frontier forts?
I'd only heard the last part of the question.
How much in nature, military reports and things like that would be required for a border military force?
Usually, there's personal messenger rather than literary description. So if there's accounting and reporting, sure, there's a certain amount of resources that are accounted for and reported. But when it comes to large-scale activity, reconnaissance, mobilization, troop, etc., those are usually sent out in person without having been written down. But that's a good question too. Anything else? Yes.
I thought my understanding of the Hebrew scriptures was that everything was oral. It wasn't written down until the Babylonian captivity.
That's been a long argument. Did you all hear the question? For a long time, people have said that the text didn't exist in written form. It was only oral form. Actually, there are plenty of suggestions that I'm going to develop in the next 7 or 8 weeks that might undermine that hypothesis. Certainly, yes, there was an oral textuality first. No question about it. And this runs through a lot of cultures. And one of the reasons why people said this is because they felt that that was the case for Homeric material. That Homer first existed in bardic, oral singing, and then was only written down in the late 7th century by Homer. But we have so many inscriptions that predate 600 BCE that the suggestion that they wouldn't have had literature too written down sort of begs the question of why not? Why not? Why would they not have literature written down? And one of the arguments that sort of suggests this too is if you look at the actual date of words, we can date words. If you look at the appearance of words in history, this is part of what is called paleography. When those words pop up, you can say, aha, this is the first occurrence of this word, and it might go into a period of vogue and then it may pass out and become obsolete. For example, when we read Shakespeare in the folio texts, we realize this man had a vocabulary of 48,000 words, which was huge, represented, I don't know what percentage of all the English language at the time, but it's very high. But he used a lot of words even for his day that were archaic. Now, let me give you an example of paleography in words, and I've probably shared this with you before. If you heard this phrase in 1975, you wouldn't have a clue what it meant. Go Google this information. A word comes into vogue and it has a certain meaning. But when it appears suddenly, that's important. So there are a lot of words that appear written down, and we can date them. There are also semantic shifts that take place. You might recall in the 70s, this stunned me at first, into the 80s, when people said they were looking at a really nice car and they said, wow, that's bad. What? We had a semantic reversal. These are linguistic tools that paleographers use. And we have a lot of words that we can date. Some of them are borrowed. Some of them pop up independently. There's diffusion going on. But in this case, what we have is in the Davidic Psalms, the Psalms ascribed to David, Psalms 1 through 8 especially. There are little notations over them that describe what instruments are to be used. And the instruments, some of which have been even found in fragmentary form, show that this is probably contemporary to the text. So there are a lot of little things we could add, but let me develop that, all right? We better get to Eden or we're never going to get to gardening at all. Question? Yes. Yes.
How authentic can oral tradition be when it's passed down from person to person, generation to generation?
Do you all hear the question? How authentic can oral tradition be when it's passed down person to person? Well, frankly, we've all played the game telephone, right? You get in a circle and you pass something whispered, and what happens? Well, some people are just ornery and they change it, automatically. But it suggests that if you are worried about transmission, you better write it down, because then it can't be misinterpreted. So there's an argument you could make that oral tradition is not the best form of transmitting material. There certainly was. There certainly was an oral tradition, because not everybody can read or write. And some people have fabulous mnemonic memories. It does suggest, by the way, for accounting and recording purposes, and I'm always one who believes that commerce has always driven the wheels of civilization. And when you're recording data, you better have something more than just oral material. So the orality versus materiality of material, certainly it's important. When you look at so many of the texts of the Hebrew scriptures, it's ridiculously boring sometimes how many of them are lists. And you can't orally transmit lists. These are, easily anyway, these are lists of genealogies, lists of materials, lists of people's names. That kind of runs counter to the idea of oral tradition too. But let's continue this discussion. We're looking at this map until it's probably going to burn a hole in the screen. So what are we looking at? We've tilted the map a little bit to put the Mesopotamian alluvial plain and the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, and the Nefud Desert highlighted. What's interesting is that the archaeology of language, the archaeology of linguistic dispersion, sort of shows that that area has indeed been a very, very ancient place, going back easily to what's called the Neolithic Revolution in the 10th millennium before the present. So for easily 10,000 years, the area that we think of right at the head of the Persian Gulf has been also not only an active place for the start of what we can call civilization, Fertile Crescent, at least in the West. The Fertile Crescent, as you know, is taking from the Persian Gulf and arcing up the Euphrates River down through what is the Levant, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and then down to Egypt. That's the Fertile Crescent. And it avoids the big deserts, particularly the big desert, the Nefud Desert, which would today be mostly Iraq and Syria and part of Jordan. I can I'm not sure if this works. There we go. So there's the Nefud Desert right there. Here's the Rub al-Khali. There's the head of the Persian Gulf. The Euphrates River here and the Tigris River here. And so this expansion from Uruk, Ubaid, going back 8th millennium BCE, this expansion moves gradually up the rivers and then across down here. And these are the people who live here in the west. The west is Amuru. So we get Amurim and Amorite, the people who live in the west. And so there is a long period of exchange between these two areas. Now, you all recognize this area right here is probably the most geologically mapped place in the world for petroleum. Yes? Well, what is fascinating is underneath where that arrow is, there is a vast stump forest under many, many layers of alluvium. It's still there. And 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, the monsoon winds from India used to blow right across Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula. Gradually, with climate change, those monsoon winds stopped bringing rain, and the area became increasingly arid. Desertification took place. We have savannas, grasslands that were there. 8,000 years ago. There was a huge period of climatic change, which we can't say exactly when domestication of animals took place. Recently, you may have seen those Siberian wolf dogs that were found frozen, yes? Some have suggested the first animal we domesticated was the dog. I kind of joke that dogs became wolves sort of became domesticated when they realized that our food tasted better than we did. But whatever the case, there's that famous Roald Dahl story about domesticating a wolf. But dogs started hanging around. Eventually, it took us a long time to take the monstrous auroch, the Bos primigenius, and breed it downward, downsize them to something manageable for cattle, and so on. The progression probably starts with sheep. Sheep are a little easier to manage than most animals. Think about their innate IQ. Goats, forget it. You can never really domesticate goats. But, ovids and caprids, and then cattle. Eventually, we started domesticating animals. Plants were much later on the scene. Probably it's the Neolithic Revolution. It's probably 10,000 years ago that we only started to begin to domesticate plants, especially with climate change, when we began to be more sedentary on river systems and started, instead of just gathering seeds, started planting them. Somebody must have eaten, some seedy plant and dropped a few seeds, and then they came around the next year. Wow, look what's there. And so that became duplicated intentionally. Whatever the case, I'm arguing in large swaths here. This area is, for all intents and purposes, we know from Colin Renfrew and others, this is also the linguistic homeland of the Indo-European languages, what's called PIE, Proto-Indo-European. And I'm not going to give you that lecture today. I just gave that last week at Stanford. But here's the extension of the Ubaid culture. You can see on this map right here, you can see essentially Uruk or Warka, and you might recall who in myth was king of Warka. Who was king of Uruk? Gilgamesh, and so on. And civilization gradually spread. You can see here from the essentially 6th millennium BCE onward. It spread upwards, up the Tigris-Euphrates. Now, interesting, the Persian Gulf has had different periods of waxing and waning. But here's what it looks like today topographically. And interesting, there was a very strong climatic change at the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, when Sumer fell to Akkad. We see plenty of evidence for that, the desertification based on pollen evidence, palynology. A lot of things going on. This is the later change, though. There are a lot of historians who believe when you have these significant shifts from the early Bronze Age, EB1 to EB2 to EB3, when you suddenly have this shift, the old Bronze Age stops, and there's a hiatus. There's a cataclysmic change, and then a new datable set of material evidence starts, and we now have the Middle Bronze Age after this. Well, you could also extrapolate much further backward to the end of this fertile savanna period, 9,000 years ago, and suddenly people forced to become socially stratified and living together in urban settlements, places like Çatalhöyük, places like Ubaid, Uruk, and suddenly, if you have a stratified society, you have hierarchical things going on, and you have these the rise of the state in Mesopotamia, roughly transitioning from the 7th to the 6th to the 5th millennium BCE. Now, here's the idea of Eden, this lush and fertile place where the peaceable kingdom, where animals are not aggressive and where we're essentially living very idyllically. But here's some interesting words. These are ancient Near Eastern words for the idea of paradise. So we'll come back to Genesis 2:8. Dilmun in Sumerian, Paradisa in Avestan, Eastern Old Iranian, which is an enclosed park. Paradida in Old Persian, Pardesu in Akkadian, Partetas in Elamite. Now, Gon is one word in Hebrew, but the later Hebrew word is Pardes, which derives from the Old Persian word. And then you get Pardisa in Aramaic. From this word, from Paradisa in Old Avestan, which is an enclosed place that becomes a park, we eventually get the Greek word paradisos and the Latin word paradisus, paradise. We can see some of the etymology of these related words here. But it can be a park-like place, but it's set apart. That's critical. It's set apart. And usually, if it's walled, it's to protect it from outside influences or the east wind or whatever, or invasion. It's private. Now, as I said, this is the most mapped place in the world, and underneath where you see the dark blue waters of the Persian Gulf, you also notice that because of alluvium over millions of years, the delta area of the Tigris-Euphrates has extended outward. The alluvium is pushed outward over a long time. But as I said, this area is the most geologically mapped place in the world for petroleum. And as I said, you do have that relict underground stump remains of a forest there. Now at the bottom of this picture, you have Bahrain down here. Now here, there's another aspect of it. And if you look very closely at this topographical map, you can see the Tigris River coming down here, the Euphrates here, and all this here is alluvium. But what do you see right here? That's a wadi, meaning a dry creek, like the California arroyo. It's only filled with water at a certain point with rain. There's another river you can't see here, but comes out of the Zagros Mountains. When I flew over the Zagros Mountains a couple times last year, I was trying to look for this river, but it flows from Susa, Shushan. Now here again, the peaceable kingdom idea. Here is what the Epic of Gilgamesh says, Tablet 9. There was a garden of the gods, all round him, that's Gilgamesh, stood bushes bearing gems, fruit of carnelian with the vine hanging from it. Beautiful to look at. Lapis lazuli leaves hung thick with fruit, sweet to see. Rare stones, agate and pearls from out of the sea. Well, of course, the Persian Gulf has long been a source for pearl fishers. When Alexander came back with his men, you may know that the Greek word for pearl is margarita. But anyway, pearl fishing from the Persian. Notice how the trees bear gems, the preciousness of this fruit. Here is the paradise tablet, the two gods, Enki and Ninurshag, from Nippur, this tablet. The land of Dilmun is holy, the land of Dilmun is bright, the land of Dilmun is pure. In Dilmun, no croaking cry the raven utters, nor does the bird of ill omen foretell calamity. Interesting. A lot of, even the Etruscans believe that when ravens take over the kingdom of the birds, it's doom. I don't want to go there too much, but let's let that one just kind of elude us. But that's the bird of ill omen, the raven. The lion kills not. Interesting. The lion kills not, nor does the ravening wolf snatch away the defenseless lamb. Unknown is the wild dog who tears the kid or the pig or birds that devour the grain. The dove does not conceal its head. No one says here, my eyes are sick. No one says here, my head is sick. No one says here, I am an old woman, and so on and so on. No one here says, I'm an old man. The bathing maiden walks here in innocence. No lustrations need to be poured. Yet there is no flood in Dilmun, place of sweet water. The somber death priest walks not here. By Dilmun's walls he has no cause for lamentations. Dilmun is the garden of the great gods. Do you see some parallels here to biblical Eden? We'll come back to this. So again, the sort of ideas of Hudson River School paradise. Maybe that's good for the upper Hudson River, but here now is the text of Genesis. And the Lord God planted a tree in the east, in Eden. Notice that phrase, in the east. Relative to where? Well, in the east, because the people who are thinking about this are not in the east. They're in the west. They're in Amuru. They're on the Levant coast. But this garden is in the east. Does that make sense? Okay, in the east, in Eden. The Lord God made all kinds of trees to grow out of the ground, trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food. In the middle of the garden were the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. A river watering the garden flowed from Eden. From there it was separated into 4 headwaters. Intriguing. That a source, the garden's a source, instead of a debouche place. The name of the first is the Pishon. It winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there's gold. The gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin and onyx are also there. The name of the second river is the Gihon. It runs through the entire land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It runs along the east side of Ashur. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. Interesting, the word Gihon in Hebrew means intermittent gusher. It flows, stops, flows, stops, flows, stops. Now, here's what I would like to observe, and before we take our break. First of all, a garden is planted. It's not wilderness, it's not wild, it's not accidental, it's a deliberate, planned place. Second, it may be surrounded by wilderness or desert, but it is not itself wilderness. Third, this first biblical garden has 2 very critical points. It's designed to fulfill food value. It's good for food. And secondly, it's aesthetic, practical. Do you see that up at the top? Trees that were pleasing to the eye and good for food, fulfilling both aesthetic and pragmatic food values. Therapeutic, necessarily then. Aesthetics as therapy. And then notice, this first almost mythical garden must be watered. It must have water. Not 1, but 4. Now, what I'm going to suggest here, intriguingly about this, is that a 4-part garden exists in ancient Zend-Avesta and Avestan pre-Achaemenid Persian literature. Here, let's go back to this. Wherever this garden is, do you see Bahrain there? The little island of Bahrain next to Qatar? What's interesting is Bahrain has aquifers with water, literally fresh water that come out from somewhere, some geological substrate, and pour out on the island of Bahrain. There you can see Qatar and Bahrain. And you may have read Zurin's work, who believes, this is the Smithsonian 1987 version, that area that you see where the Persian Gulf was not always underwater. That it was a lush, verdant garden place between where the 4 rivers debouche into the Persian Gulf and then all the way down to the Strait of Hormuz. Zurins and others believe that whole area 10,000 years ago was a vast, lush valley. And the forests where the tree stumps have been found actually evidence some of that. Now, let's stop and take a very, very quick break. Okay? I held you up a little bit, and I'll explain my rationale. I always worry if all the classes let out at the same time, the lines are really going to be long. So I tried to stagger my break a little bit. All right? And I'm told that when I do that, if I stagger it by about 10 minutes, it means that the lines are going to be a little bit more manageable. Now, I'm told at the break that most of you didn't understand a word I said for the first hour. I'm exaggerating. I hope that's not the case. Do you all understand the difference, though, between the maximalists and the minimalists? Yes. Okay. The maximalists believe that there is historicity to the biblical material. The minimalists challenge that. for so long the tide has swung back and forth, as it always will. It appears to be swinging back to a certain degree towards a position of some historicity. We will see. I guarantee you, if you wait another 10 years, if we all last that long, it might swing back the other way. But for now, it appears that, and what I gave you for the first 45 minutes, I'm going to develop. That was just the sketchiest of suggestion that one might see growing evidence for a pendulum swing back toward the middle. But let's continue now. I apologize if I'm using sesquipedalian words, and I'll try not to use terms without giving better understanding. Now, here, thank you for this. This is the area that Urus Zarins and others have suggested may well be where an Eden was. And if not there, fortunately, Bahrain has a site called Dilmun. This whole area then may well have not been underwater, may have been highly vegetated. And as I said, right here, we do have all these stumps that are preserved in anaerobic conditions, meaning no oxygen to decompose those organic stumps, and deeply buried. And so notice, this is from Zarin's map, by the way. Notice that wadi I showed you that came in from the west, meaning a dry riverbed. That's what wadi means in Arabic. Now, I would actually reverse these two. Gihon, the Karun River, which comes out of towards Susa, an area in Iran today, out of the Zagros Mountains. I would propose that this should be switched, that Gihon should be better down here. Now, interestingly, if this once was savanna grasslands before the 9th, 8th millennium BCE, so relatively speaking 10,000 years ago, when the monsoon winds came through, if this were still grasslands and savanna, that river could have been supported. Those of you who've been to North Africa, to Libya and to Tunisia, know that the Atlas Mountains used to be heavily forested, and there were cities like Leptis Magna and others, Sabrata, on the coast, which were well fed by streams from the Atlas Mountains. Today, they're all desert. That's only in the last 2,000 years. This river here may have existed 10,000 years ago if this were savannas and other vegetative types, but with desertification, that river dried up. This river is still fairly active, so it isn't an intermittent gusher, as Gihon means. That's why I would switch the two, that this would be Pishon and this would be Gihon. And what actually also supports that is the gold found in the area of the Zagros Mountains, maybe the land of Havilah. But whatever the case, let's continue with this idea of Eden and also connect it to Dilmun, which was a site here on Bahrain. Now, that's Dilmun in Sumerian, and these are the Ubaid culture, these tumuli, all over the area of Bahrain. As I said, Bahrain has had historically, not necessarily right now, but has historically had a lot of springs coming into it. This is the site also of Sa'ar in Bahrain, which is a site that is, you can go back 5-6 millennia for this site. The gardens of Bahrain today are well watered from these internal springs that somehow, as I said, geological aquifers pop out on this island. The sweet water that you mentioned, you saw in that hymn from Nippur. Did you remember that hymn? The sweet waters of Dilmun. So Dilmun then is this area here, this Mesopotamian Sumerian paradise, and I personally think the rivers, the one river that's no longer there, but in fact the border of Iraq kind of almost works along that wadi dry bed. You had a river coming out here, a river coming out here, and the two major rivers. Now, if you read the Hebrew of Genesis 2, it's not Euphrates, it's Frat. And if you read, it's not Tigris, it's Hiddekel. But Hiddekel and Tigris are really the same words, believe it or not. The LR exchange on the coronal reflex, roof of the mouth. A lot of languages have problems distinguishing L and R. And D and T are both what we call the sort of labiodental, well, they're D and T are apicodental stops. One is with the vocal cords and one isn't. So D versus T, and G versus K, and R versus L. So if you work out those letters, Tigris, the T, switches with the D in Hiddekel. The Q of Hiddekel switches with the G of Tigris, and the L switches with the R. The L of Hiddekel switches with the R of Tigris. So they're really the same word, Hiddekel, Tigris. Just you have to know that someone's moved the stops from voice. Hiddekel, Hiddequel. Tigris, Tigris. Frat in Hebrew, Phrat, but Euphrates is the Greek name for it, the true river, the true Frat, the good Frat. Anyway, these four rivers then, notice four rivers. Four rivers. Do they flow from? Well, rivers don't flow that way. Do they flow from or to? Maybe we have some textuality interesting point about it, because Rosh, headwater, can also not just be Rosh, but where they come to a head. So here now we have Lucas Cranach's Adam and Eve in the garden, and with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And you all know, I'm sure, because you're so scholarly, that the word for apple, the genus for apple, malus, we get malic acid, yes. Well, malus for apple, interestingly, the Vulgate says, aha, the word for evil is also malus. Ergo, the fruit must have been an apple because of evil brought in. That's a clerical textuality. But notice that Eve looks so knowing, and Adam looks so befuddled. Right? I try not to show this to my wife because she says, well, isn't that always the case? But you have this transference going on here, and my wife usually catches on to things far faster than I do, but I don't find this problematic. But here, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden that happens, whether it's the loss of innocence, moving from childhood to adulthood, learning that you have to follow a clock and tell time, the loss of paradise, whatever you want to call this transition, whether in Jungian archetype or reality, whether in historical truth that there was massive climate change and we no longer were herders or hunters and gatherers and foragers, we had to become farmers, which happens in the next chapter or two, chapter 4. But being expelled from the Garden of Eden, interestingly, we've tried to come back to it ever since. Right? Haven't we all tried to get back to paradise? Impossible. Now when I go to Hawaii, I don't run around like I used to. I would prefer to sit down in the shade, watch somebody else run around. But anyway, you have this expulsion from the garden, the angel with the flaming sword, and so on. Now, as I said, the archaeology of language, Colin Renfrew, distribution, it's so fascinating that if even you go back to what we call the zone of human Paleolithic, everything seems to come from this area here for what we call Homo sapiens sapiens. Isn't that intriguing? And it does seem to work historically. As I said, Colin Renfrew has the origin of Proto-Indo-European from this same area where the word 100 is. If you know Lord Colin Renfrew, I had a good conversation with him in January. But anyway, It's the same basic area. Now, this is where, according to the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Archaeology, this is where pottery seems to start, between Jericho to basically the area around Göbekli Tepe, if you've seen the oldest temple in the world in Sanliurfa, Turkey. This area seems to be very important source-wise. But if you look at the origin of writing and the tokens and so on, that Denise Schmott-Besserat has shown in Scientific American and Archaeology, that the pre-writing tokens seem also to start from these same areas of the Fertile Crescent. Now, what we call in archaeology pre-pottery Neolithic means that around 10,000 years ago, people weren't actually firing clay. And before we were sedentary and lived in cities, you can imagine nomads don't carry big clay pots around. The local peoples here, we call them the Ohlone, they didn't carry big pots around because they were transhumance nomads. They were migratory. What did they have for receptacles? Baskets. That's what nomadic peoples use, baskets. But once you become a farmer and you become sedentary, pottery also develops. And where is the pottery? Where is the clay? The clay is the end product of erosion, always. It's the finest particles. It always comes from the mountains. And where do people always live? On rivers close to oceans. And that's where the erosional products end up, right where we live. So clay became very important for receptacles. We learned pyrotechnology, how to manage it, how to fire it. Soon metals came because we got to a temperature threshold where we could hold the heat in, even with bellows, to bring it up to a melting point of about 1,000 degrees Celsius, which is where copper melts at 1083, gold at 1060. We began to manage metals, first copper, although gold we could pick up and easily manage because you can work gold without having to heat it very much. All kinds of transitions in the Neolithic Revolution. Colin Renfrew with language expansion, massive climatic change, geomorphology, etc., all seem to dovetail about the same time. That at the dawn of what we call human prehistory, you all know the word Adam means man of the earth, or earth. And that Eve is not really a name either. It means mother, Hawa. So they're not really names, they're more titles. But here we have an early Neolithic figurine from Ain Ghazal from Jordan. It's not exactly what you'd call sculptural requisites that we have. I'm not sure you can see it closely. I'm afraid it doesn't show up in the picture. But what I always find fascinating with this sculpture, I've seen it when it was being conserved at the Institute of Archaeology in London, where I did my PhD. Looking at this sculpture, what you actually interestingly see is on the chest of this sculpture, right here, there are two breasts, and they have extremely long nipples. Why would you make a sculpture of a woman with extremely long nipples? As if this is your sine qua non of sculptural beauty. Well, if you have really long nipples, sorry folks, it suggests you've been successfully suckling your children. You've been a successful nurse to your children for milk. And so having long nipples says, those babies have been pulling on them, and I'm a successful mother. So it could be a sign of beauty for that era, especially if infant mortality would otherwise be high and longevity would not necessarily be high, and so on. Anyway, it's a fascinating sculpture. I'm sorry that you can't see those long nipples, but maybe you're glad you can't see them either. Anyway, so we come back to this topography. Now you can, again, you can sort of see, well, there's one of those wadis right there, which I think is the Gihon, and then the river coming out of Susa there, out of the Zagros, and the Tigris, which is the Hiddekel, and the Euphrates, which is the Frat. And they converge here. Not flow from here, they converge here. So it might depend on how you read Roche. head, semantically. Now, there we have Raphael's, expulsion from the garden, and then here, used to do Giovanni. Here he's showing the angel kicking them out of the garden with a nice gate that's walled up and can't get back to it anyway. Here again, Ghiberti's doors, same thing. Now, what I find fascinating, being someone who loves carpets, rugs, and so on, and I collect quite a few, and I was in Iran last year and picked up a few more, and wherever I go, I pick up new rugs. Now, what's interesting is the idea, the original idea behind these rugs. It's a garden. And if you don't have a garden, you can roll this one up and take it with you. You have a pool of water with lush vegetation with a wall, an enclosed garden. That's the idea of paradisa. I do believe that this garden motif is central to most of the rugs. And here you see others. You also have trees of life in the gardens, and so on. Lotus, you see pools with lotus floating in the garden. Here literally is a tree of life in this Kerman. If you have this idea of derakti, the tree of life, or like a tree, pomegranates. Here's literally a paradise garden rug that I bought in Istanbul about a year ago, and so on. Now look, here, to the east, in Eden, and so on, you've got this idea of, in the interlinear, about the aesthetic and practical values. And notice the first word is gan, garden in Hebrew, G-A-N. Later on, the Persian word pardes comes into the text, particularly in the Shir HaShirim, but with Persian influence again. But the garden, here notice the rivers, and as what I said, that's Hiddekel. That's the Tigris. So the D exchanges for a T, the Q exchanges for a G, the L exchanges for an R. That's very common language transposition. And then notice the Frat is not Ufrat, it's just Frat, as I said. And you've got the river, the Gihon, there it is, Gihon, which is intermittent, just like the spring in Jerusalem. It flows every 45 minutes. So you've got these rivers, and notice it's talking about the heads of the river, which is interesting. Heads of the river. This idea of Rosh, beginning or heads. Maybe we've somehow not quite gotten that right, that the rivers don't flow out of the garden, but into the garden. Whatever. By the way, there's Havila, gold country, Highway 49, California, right? Now, here's an interesting Persian text. Therefore, O Yima Jamshed, make thee a walled vara, long as the riding ground on every side of the square. Thither bring the seeds of sheep and oxen, of men, of dogs, of birds, of red blazing fires. Therefore make thee a vara, long as the riding ground on every side of the square, to be an abode for men, a vara, long as the riding ground, and so on, so on, so on. There shalt thou make waters flow in a bed 4 hathra long. Essentially, we're getting to be a hathra, quarter of a mile. You settle birds on the green, never fades, food never fails, dwelling places, and so on and so on. Seeds of men and wood in the best, finest earth. Bring seeds of cattle, etc., etc., etc. Specimens of mankind for to make, whatever here. We won't get into this, but a little tricky. Seeds of every kind of tree, cypress, odor, cedar, rose, citron, jasmine of this earth, and so on. Fruit, the date, the sweetest of odor, and so on and so on. And this vara, enclosed park. That's the word. The word right there in vara, after vara, is paradisa in Persian. Paradisa. All right. No, whatever. This is not very nice, but never mind. You can read it, right? It's a bit exclusionary. Whatever. Isn't that interesting that you have this Zendavestan text of a paradisa? Now, here's another one of these paradise garden rugs, and it's what's interesting is This is what we call in Persian, in Farsi, shahar bagh, or shar bagh, which means a four-part garden. And I do believe the Garden of Eden echoes that same idea of a parterre, a four-part garden, with waters flowing out of it from a fountain and a pool. It just seems to be very, very much part of this makeup. There's another one you see. Clearly, a pool that flows in four directions, the Shahar Bagh. And of course, Cyrus the Great, like most Persian kings, unlike their contemporaries, or the people who preceded them, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, the Persians, notice, what does a king hold? Not a sword, not a spear, not a weapon, but a flower. Why? Why would a king hold a flower? Well, if it's a contrarian idea, perhaps, but a flower is the illustration of ephemerality, the brevity of life, the brevity of beauty. That's a nice thing for a king and a leader to hold in hand, isn't it? That power is very transitory. Intriguing, yes? Well, don't you wish other people had that idea? Now, here's Cyrus's garden. It's a parterre garden. We now know that it's divided into four parts. My mentor, David Stronach, University of California, Berkeley, the chair of the Near Eastern Studies Department, excavated this. It's published in Oxford, 1972. But here are these words. Paradisa becomes Pardes, becomes Paradisos, becomes Paradisus, and so on. And of course, now in Farsi, it's the same word, Firdaus. Here's what Pasargad looked like. We now have a cross channel there. There is Pasargad, Cyrus's garden. He had a very small pavilion in a big garden, by the way. That's kind of nice, isn't it? He didn't have a McMansion. He had a pavilion in a garden. I like that. That's what it probably looked like. This is Farzin Rezayan's reconstruction. You see it's Chahar Bagh. It's four-part there. And what grew there? There's another blow-up of it. There's probably what could have looked like. That's may look big to you, but it's a pavilion in a huge garden. What did he have there? Well, we know that the rose has been around a long time. We know that, in fact, that's the Rosa persica. We know, again, looking at the overall garden, that we know the date tree has been around 6,000 years in this region. We know that the almonds have been around a long time. That's 5,000 years in the Near East. We know, and so on. We know that the apple, this is what's called the Malus Siversi, and what Theophrastus calls the Malus persica, the Persian apple. By the way, it's a crab apple. And in Switzerland, my wife whacked her knee on a corner, and my daughter brought out her crab apple cream and smeared it on my wife's knee. The bruise went away in 10 seconds, and so did the pain. Yeah, so that's Swiss homeopathy for you. Anyway, crab apples. Now, here is the fig, right? Look at this. That's 11,000 years of figs. So these are probably the kinds of gardens that we're talking about. Long-term gardens with these Mediterranean or Near Eastern fruits. Citron and so on. You may know in Hebrew the idea of the eros, the citron, the citrus medica. We all know that citrus came out of Asia. But these are the kind of things that were probably in Cyrus's garden. And of course, the pomegranate, the Puniga granatum, which is again almost 5,000 years old of cultivation. So, to finish up with this, of course, vitis vinifera too. Some even think that the grape was the very first plant cultivated because it had kind of divine connections, psychotropic benefits, made you feel like a god. Whatever. Those are the gardens that may be, that, if we're looking at the long-term cultivation, here you even have tulipan. Look at the turbans, you see. There we have turbans, tulip. Maybe yours have already bloomed like mine. But the Garden of Eden, whatever we can say about where it was, or Dilmun, the same idea of paradise, these are very, very old words. And if this four-part garden of the Shahar Bagh of ancient Persia is in some way either echoing, reminiscent, or even a source idea for the partitioning of four rivers and channels, there's David Stronach's image of the garden. Whatever the case, you can just see it here. I'm not going to go into all the details. But notice the canticles, the Song of Songs, the Canticum Canticorum, or the Shir Eshirim. A garden enclosed is my love. That word is literally pardes, or it's gan na'ol in Hebrew, but it's also pardes, the Pyridiza of the ancient Persians. So I'm just going to finish up here. You see these Edenic garden rugs, which are echoes of this idea of paradise, because they're also the very same word, Pyridiza. And it goes on into monastic gardens, where you had the four trees of Garden of Eden suggested, the fig, the pomegranate, the date, and so on. And here you even see it in the famous Norman Palace, Palazzo Normanni mosaics, that this is a paradise, a paradise. So, we've come a long way. I've gone over, but this idea of paradise, this idea of garden enclosed, this idea of cultivation, planned, deliberate cultivation, wherever it took place, it seems likely it was in the east, as the text says. I think we can pretty much configure geographically that the people who were living in Israel, thinking about this, were looking to the east for this source place where they themselves felt they also derived. Thank you very much.